I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source, staring down the global trade war with Mark Blyth at Brown University. He is the people's economist from Scotland who takes us home to his village pub in Dundee every once in a while to tell all of us what the powers that be are up to. Mark, we've been bracing for a universal trade war, not just China, but Canada, France, Mexico, you name it. Uninhabited islands where only penguins and seals live will be touched. President Trump's ultimate weapon of choice in such a war is a 125% tariff on most of what comes from China, raising prices, of course. But the Trump line also says that the flood of new tariff income could pay for what he calls his big, beautiful tax cut. Almost nobody you can read thinks Donald Trump is right about these tariffs, Mark, but is he serious?
That's the $64,000 question, isn't it? Is he serious? All right, well, think about this, Chris, right? Everything you said is right and also simultaneously incorrect, because all the tariffs were rescinded once the bond market crapped itself on April the 9th. And then we were in a 90-day holding period, but then some tariffs came back, etc., etc. So we don't really know. Now, here's how I like to think about this, and I think it's a useful way to orient ourselves in all this disorientation. What's the problem that Trump and people around him are trying to solve? He's trying to offer people a version of the future which isn't just exactly the status quo. Now, you might say it's one that harkens back to an economic politics of the 50s, a social politics of the 40s, and an imperial politics of the 19th century, but it is nonetheless different. And the idea behind the whole thing is reindustrialization. Now, Biden did this, or tried to do this, with the Inflation Reduction Act. And that was an attempt to build new green sectors that we didn't get before, and to build sort of industrial capacity after the shock of COVID, but to do it on green lines. And what you've got with Trump is, to hell with the green stuff, that's going to zero. What we're going to do is we're going to double down on our carbon assets, because that's the business models of the key Republican firms. And then what we're going to do is reindustrialize on that basis behind tariffs. Now, Biden kept up all of his tariffs, right?
But different industries in this case.
Exactly. Now, that's significant, right? He's doubling down on the carbon sector because that's the core business models of Republican states. Think about what they do from Alaska all the way down through North Dakota to Texas, all the way out to the Panhandle and up. Fuels, farms, fertilizer, food, feedstock, plastics, petrochemicals. That's what they do. That's why he's doubling down on this stuff. Now, what Biden had was tariffs, an industrialization strategy, an enabled state, and a partnership with the universities. Kind of makes sense if you want to do something new. What we've got here is very, very high levels of tariffs, kicking the universities in the nuts, and slashing your state off at the legs. It doesn't really add up. Now, if you think that tariffs are magic, as he seems to do, and you just push them high enough and everything will come home and magically things that we haven't built in 20 years will be built despite the fact that we don't have any of the skills necessary to build it, then that's one version of what he's up to. The other one, when he basically meets something that says no, which is China or the bond market, it then becomes something that we're going to bargain away. Scott Bessent comes out and says, oh, the unsustainability of the tariffs against China, clearly these are going to be reduced. So then the whole thing becomes, you're not serious about industrialization, because if you are, you need to bring them up and keep them up. You're going to bargain them away, which basically means you're a big free trader, and all you're doing is using a big stick to basically do free trade again. So which one is it? And we don't know. Nobody knows, because it's week by week, month by month, and everything just gets dropped and reinterpreted.
But you think he's on to the reindustrialization agenda?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's sort of, tariffs are one part of that strategy if you want to go down that road. But, it's a bit like sort of saying, I've got a problem with my leg. I'll go to the doctor. He says I need to have it amputated. So what I'll do is I'll do it myself in the kitchen with a knife. Not the smartest way of doing it.
Yeah. Meantime, to hell with the green agenda of all sorts.
Well, because think about it, Chris. If your business model is fuel, farm, fertilizer, carbon, all the rest of it, what do you think the IRA and the Green Revolution is? It basically means that the value of your assets go to zero, right? So there's no accommodations here. Like, the people who run those states are perfectly well aware of the fact that if the Green Revolution comes complete, all of the things that they do, fracking, gas, all the rest of it, becomes much less valuable. So why on earth would they want to go along with it?
Go back one step. Why the 125% tariff, which sounds on its face to be utterly foolish. Why would anybody more than double the price of things you're importing from China? It sounds absurd. Is it a bluff with Xi Jinping and China? And what is he bargaining toward?
So one way of looking at this is that it's calculated to basically bring severe disruptions to trade. But before all the ships don't arrive with all the Christmas stuff, you then have a grand bargain and you get the tariffs down and you do a reset, and that's one possible outcome. The other one is they have no idea what they're doing. They got freaked out when the bond market told them no, and therefore they dropped tariffs on everybody else for 90 days, but doubled them on China. And then all the sycophants around them said, "Sir, you're a genius. This is all about smoking out China all along. You're amazing." And actually they're just ad-libbing it and nobody knows what's going on.
Why do we have the impression that China is almost up for a trade war?
They've been diversifying their economy away from exports to the US for the past 15 years. Their exports to GDP peaked at 40% in 2008. Ultimately, what they will suffer is a demand shock, which is to say that there will be no demand coming from Americans for their stuff, and that will be painful. But this is a society that has massive amounts of savings, massive amounts of reserves, and can basically engage in a lot of fiscal stimulus to offset that. We have a supply shock. They make the stuff that we need and consume, and not just plastic toys, machinery, electronics, etc. So once you basically turn that off, we don't know how to make that stuff. We haven't made it in 20 years, hence why he wants to reindustrialize. But in the short term, you're the one that's going to be feeling it. That's how China thinks about it.
We read that the Chinese calculation is that they can take the pain of this adjustment more than the United States can, and that they will win somehow.
Well, that's exactly what I just said. I mean, essentially, that the United States faces a supply shock, it's harder to find supply. They face a demand shock, and basically it's much easier for them to replace demand. So there's an asymmetry in how this is going to play out. Now, you can say you put up to 125, 145, whatever you want. Essentially, you just stop trade between the two nations. Well, who suffers more? Trump's basically out saying, well, the children are going to have $1, $3 rather than $30. But it's probably going to go a little bit further than the doll shelf in Walmart. So we'll see where it goes.
So what happens to free trade?
Well, it depends. I mean, like I said, the entire thing could just be a bluff and a head game. And once consumers get really freaked out at the shortages, and Trump says, it was all just a bargain all along, I just wanted the deal, right? And comes along and does that, and then everyone sort of goes, yeah, okay, and then we sort of reset it. So we've had 6 months of disruption and losses. And then we get more chaos. I mean, this is the chaos agent administration. This is what they do.
Well, I'm glad you said it first, and we'll come back to the whole chaos question. But about free trade, I mean, we've had a party line in this country in public conversation. I'm thinking Bill Clinton and ever since. But that free trade is good for the United States overall. We've lost a lot of jobs. We've saved a lot on cheap goods coming from abroad. Mm-hmm. And we've come to enjoy this catbird seat in the world economy. What more could we want? What doesn't satisfy Donald Trump? And what is he putting at risk? Before
we do what he's putting at risk, right? Who benefits from that system? Well, American corporations certainly benefited. American corporate profits are now 12.5% of GDP. They've never been higher. Who else has benefited? Top 10% of the income distribution, particularly top 1%. Whose real wages haven't risen in 30, if not 40 years, the bottom 60%? Who lives in parts of the country that have been hollowed out, decimated by deindustrialization and seen the quality of their life collapse, deaths of despair increase? Who are the people that volunteer for the military that go off to Iraq and get their limbs blown off? It's not anybody in the top 10% who lives on the coasts. That's what animates Trump and the people behind him. There is a sense of profound injustice to what's happened to them vis-a-vis everybody else. Now, what has he put at risk? He's put at risk something that basically can't continue forever anyway. So here's how the game has worked for the past 30 years. So we've decided that we would take our plant and equipment and move it to China to take advantage of cheap labor costs and a lack of environmental regulation, essentially, and good infrastructure. And then we ship it back. So then Walmart basically pays a guy in China or wherever it is, South Korea, a bunch of dollars. Now, they don't use dollars, and they don't want those dollars going one for one into their domestic economy because it will make people spend more money. Prices will go up, wages will go up, people have a good time. Why would you be against that? Because you're an exporter. You want your stuff to be cheap so that the other side buys it. So you repress people's consumption, you make them have really high savings rate, you don't give them a lot of cash to spend, etc., etc. Now, you're now sitting with a pile of dollars. You've swapped out some of it for your domestic currency. What do you do with those dollars? You buy a treasury bill. This is the why we have so much debt. I mean, the thing that infuriates me, Chris, is this whole thing about, well, the country's bankrupt and we've got this huge debt and this huge deficit and it's terrible. Okay, first of all, who's buying all this shit? Who's on the other side of the trade every day of the week buying the debt if it's so toxic and we're spending too much? It's because the people on the other side of the export trade have to put that dollars to work somewhere, so they buy a treasury bill. That's essentially handing the Americans back the money so they can spend it again. And we've been doing this dollar recycling with Asia for the past 30 years. Now, the only downside to this is while you got lots of cheap stuff in Walmart, you stop making huge amounts of stuff yourself, your skills disappear, and your bottom 60% your income distribution gets squeezed as that country and other countries rise. This is what Branko Milanovic showed us with the elephant graph 15 years ago. So there's something at risk here, which is eventually, if you keep running this model, the United States becomes Australia with a lot of nukes. Very expensive, doesn't really make anything. And then the rest of the world has to say, why are we holding these treasury bills? At that point, it comes to bite. So everybody recognized this, Chris. The free trade consensus collapsed in 2015. The Brits went out with Brexit. Then Hillary Clinton stood against the Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic trade partnerships, which were really investor protection agreements. There's been no serious moves in free trade since 2004 when the Doha round collapsed because the Global South said sod you to your agricultural exports. So, we've been living in a sort of a fantasy land of dollar recycling where we've been hollowing out large parts of the American economy. And finally, those people found a champion, and that champion is Donald Trump.
I'm glad you've introduced the lower 60% of the working incomes. That translated as MAGA. What are the Trump gestures these days doing for MAGA? There's MAGA in our pub right here, too.
So there's an interesting coalition around Trump. There's basically three sets of forces. So the first one is the National Conservatives. Think Bannon, think Marjorie Taylor Greene, think Tucker Carlson. They are the ones who want to deregulate the economy, improve wages for the working class, rebuild in America, have a more conservative social policy, get away from woke stuff, etc., etc. Then you've got on the other side of that your traditional Republicans who have decided to stick with Trump. Think Marco Rubio. What do they want? They want tax cuts and they want to be mean to China. Then you've got the tech lords. What do they want? They want to take over the universities' research budgets. That's pretty much what they're after. They want to get tax cuts, and they don't want to be mean to China because they depend on it for a lot of stuff. So this is a very unstable set of elements, and what you get out of that varies from week to week. But what Trump believes, I think erroneously, and everybody else thinks erroneously, is that by simply having very, very large tariffs, lots of industries are going to give up all the stuff they've built over the past 30 years in terms of manufacturing in 5 different places, assembling in 3 different places, and selling in 10 different markets. And they're all going to come home and we're going to make iPads in America. And it simply isn't going to be true, not only because that's not the way corporations work and they're not going to do all that stuff. If you want to do that, you need to do serious investments in skills, and there's no sign of that happening with this administration.
Well, we're speaking of MAGA. The new line, I hadn't heard it until today, is Trump's economics is MAGA Maoism, meaning his base to begin with, but the touch of Maoism is absolute authoritarianism. He makes the deals. He sets the tariffs himself personally. He does the negotiating. It's a one-man show.
Yeah, but I mean, that could also be Putin, and there's nothing particularly Maoist about that. I think the Maoist stuff comes in basically in their treatment of cultural institutions and their hatred of existent elites. You want to send the elites out to the countryside and the factories, and if there's a Maoist connection, that's where it is. It's a useful label, but I don't see what it adds to the conversation. It's just another way of sort of thinking about the Trump administration, and there's plenty of those already.
Mark, you've got a new book just in time for all of this. Everything we're talking about in terms of tariffs means more inflation. Inflation is especially sensitive. It may have been what elected Donald Trump. And you've got a book out today called Inflation, a guide for users and losers. Give us the short form on the inflationary piece here and how he dares talk about remedies that will clearly drive prices up.
Well, I mean, first of all, is it clear, Chris? Because in 2016, we brought in a bunch of tariffs and there was no inflation until COVID happened in 2021. So maybe tariffs at this level would be inflationary. I think that's probably the case. But let's do the four fun stuff. Let's figure out why it was that inflation threw out all the incumbents all around the world and not just the Democrats. Because there's a huge disconnect between what people like me do when we calculate inflation rates and look at the rate of change in 80,000 prices over an extended period. And then when people go to the store and they see eggs have gone up, and they go to the gas station, they see gas has gone up, and they look at the rent and they say, how much am I meant to pay for this shithole that I'm living in? And then what happens is because we're statisticians, we think all these things are a bit too volatile. So we take them out of the index for measuring inflation because they're too volatile. So we have core inflation. And then we tell people, well, things aren't that bad. They've only gone up 4%. And then in their actual experience, when they go to the supermarket, John Otters did this at Bloomberg. He calculated anti-core, just looked at the volatile stuff that happens at the bottom 60% of the income distribution spends the vast majority of their income on. And they would be facing inflation rates of around 10 to 12%. So that disconnect that people talked about between, we hear the economy's doing great, but people think it's miserable.
Right.
Totally makes sense. Completely makes sense, right? Now, second part of this, what is the inflationary story on tariffs? It's not just tariffs. Think about what generated inflation in 2021. It was two big supply shocks. Number one, COVID, you couldn't get stuff. That's supply, right? And then in Ukraine, you can't get gas if you're in Europe. That's supply. And that meant a shortage and that pushed up prices. It's really quite simple. We're used to thinking from a kind of playbook of the 1970s that, to quote Milton Friedman, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But what happened in 2021 really didn't have that much to do with money. Some people wanted to blame the Biden stimulus checks, but there were countries all around the world that didn't issue stimulus checks that also had inflation. So once you start thinking of supply shocks, Trump gets interesting. Trump is a policy-induced supply shock. And we're going to get a lot more of this because if you're talking about increased geopolitical uncoupling, greater competition, rival trade blocs, rival tariffs, these are all basically the functional equivalent of supply shocks. So it's not just the fact that it's coming from China and it's 120% or whatever it is. That will just stop trade and that will create a shortage and that'll push up prices. It's the fact that we've gone to a world now where rather than ripping down barriers and encouraging more commerce, regardless of its distributional effects that we touched on earlier, what we've got here is a situation whereby by policy, by design, we're pushing supply shocks through a highly interconnected global system. That has got to be inflationary.
I have read your book, Mark, but the basic drift of it I got was that you can argue till the cows come home about the particular causes of a particular inflation, but the long-term trend is up.
Yes, that is quite correct, Chris. Exactly.
And what does that do to us socially, politically, even culturally, to be living in a sort of permanently inflationary system?
A better way to think about it is it's more kind of a return to a long-term mean, because we had this period of 30 years where inflation disappeared. And that happened because 500 million Chinese people joined the global labor market. Corporations discovered the IT revolution in the container ship. Technological changes came online. Demography was in the good way. Most countries were open to immigration, which also helped. And all that stuff has gone into reverse. So even without policy-induced supply shocks, right, all of that's done. It was a one-time gig. You don't get to do China's deflation again, right? Now, to a certain extent, for the short term, Europe's going to get this because if nothing's coming to the United States, a lot of Chinese stuff's going to end up in Europe, and that's going to push down prices. But eventually, they're going to have to put up tariffs because otherwise it wipes out their industries because there's such a huge volume of it. So we're just going to get more of these shocks as we go along the road, Chris. That's just as baked into the cake.
Come back to the Trumponomics question of is he serious, but also does he have any real idea of what the effects are going to be? I mean, my general impression, and I'd put it to the people in the pub too, but is that we're looking at arbitrary, changeable, utterly uncertain rules of the road as long as Trump is leading us. Another name for it is chaos. And how long can we live this way?
Well, you can be a chaotic attractor on one side of the world doing all sorts of random stuff and it's very disruptive, but eventually the rest of the world gets on with its business. The United States is an exceptional country in the sense that, we're 22% of GDP and less than, 7% of the global population. In fact, it might be even less than that. Quite extraordinary. A lot of that is based upon this dollar recycling and treasury recycling that I was talking about earlier. And what we've done now is we've convinced people that the Treasury is not a safe asset, it's a risk asset, because Trump will basically do things that make the market very nervous. This is going to accelerate a process where lots of other countries start looking for alternatives, not just to the dollar, but to the American market and to American security arrangements. So chaos and disorder on one side produces different orders and new orders on the other side. What we saw with the elections in Canada and the elections in Australia was very interesting.
Yep.
What you had there was basically two places. One where Trump had said, I'm literally going to take you over, and they said, no thanks, elbows up. And on the other one, you had a candidate who was basically aping Trump. And when push comes to shove, it turns out, having seen what Trumponomics actually is, Australians and Canadians went, that's all right, we'll pass. I don't think we want this. So you're not seeing as kind of like a viral thing where what happens in America runs wild around the rest of the world. You might in Britain. I think Britain's kind of doomed in this way. It's always been the case that whatever happens in America 5 years later happens in the UK. So I think you're looking at Farage, the guy who brought you Brexit, probably being the next Prime Minister.
Amazing.
Yeah, but as for other places, probably not. If anything, even with the screw up in Germany today with the appointment of Merz, they're on a track to basically spend more, to reindustrialize, but to spend more domestically, to rearm, etc., etc. So the world's changing, and, Trump has been part of the catalyst for doing this. But just because it's chaos here doesn't mean it's chaos everywhere else.
Different tack here. How would you, Mark Blyth, summarize for Donald Trump the actual history of American tariffs? Two in particular, the McKinley tariff, 1890, when American industry was young and growing and deserved protection, they thought. But then the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which in 1930, more protection for American industry, but it led to trade wars, serious trade wars. I mean, we grew up in high school being taught that it brought on the Depression.
That's a uniquely American perspective on the Great Depression, which puts American agency and sort of like silliness at the forefront of it. I don't actually think that's a credible reading of what happened at all. I mean, essentially you had chaos, disorder, inflation after World War I throughout all of Europe. The Americans wanted their money back in the interwar period, but reparations were getting in the way. We had a whole series of agreements, the Dawes Plan, the Young Plan, that kept Germany stable for a while. Then the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to cool the Wall Street bubble, but it actually ends up more. Then there's the crash of the Wall Street bubble. There's been banking failures all over the place. I mean, Smoot-Hawley's part of it, but the world economy was already in the shitter by the late 20s, and it got worse and worse. Did it cause the Great Depression? Absolutely not. I think it's massively overstated. And also, there's actually an argument that what it did was led to the Reciprocal Trade Acts in 1934, which began a gradual opening of trade again. In terms of the McKinley tariff, I mean, I'm not particularly expert on this. The American industry sat behind the highest protective tariffs in the world for the whole of the 19th century, right? We didn't become anything close to a free trader until the 1940s, 1950s. So the McKinley tariff isn't just one of them. I mean, essentially, the tariff basically was the Republican policy for the working classes, keep out foreign competition, and then have ruthless deregulation and extreme competition domestically, and then that combination of competition and low prices creates a strong economy. In many ways, what they're trying to do is back to that 19th century understanding of how things work. I think it's also the case that McKinley ended up reducing or negotiating away his tariffs. I mean, I can't remember the details exactly, but I think that the tariff thing is, our historical comparisons are a little bit skewed by the fact that, in my opinion, I think that we really overplay how important Smoot-Hawley was, because it makes America the arbiter of a system that they were not the arbiter of.
Well, anybody else would say caution in the present moment. Think of the risks, think of the real effects. And I'm thinking specifically of the people in our pub here.
Well, yes, I mean, there are real risks and real things, but, the people in the pub are also the people who voted for these guys.
42% of them voted for Donald Trump for president.
Yeah, and he got basically both branches and the presidency. And the alternative was a Democratic Party who had absolutely nothing to say or offer other than the status quo, which really benefits the professional managerial class, the top 20%, and whose main thing was, look at me, I got another celebrity endorsement, isn't that great? That was the campaign as far as I could remember.
I think the mood in the crowd, though, is uncertainty and confusion. They don't get explanations, and they can't be sure of any result coming out of all this this period, the first 100 days.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think there's also sort of, a tendency, particularly on the sort of the Democratic side and, if you want, the left side in general, to every time Trump wakes up in the morning and sends a tweet, it might as well be Armageddon.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it's not, right? I mean, there's loads of dodgy things going on. Don't get me wrong. Rule of law, democracy, all that stuff, deeply worrying. I sit in an Ivy League university. They're coming after us. We know exactly what's going on. But the notion is sort of like, we'll focus on what he did today, right? That's the end of the world then.
That's exactly what I'm trying to get away from. What is his goal? And who is he checking with?
Well, as told you, his goal is basically on a Monday morning, it's reindustrialization and being good to the benighted working classes of the United States. And on Wednesday, it's reducing all those tariffs so that we could have incredibly free trade. So we don't know what it is, and that's the problem.
Mark Blyth, take another tack on this whole scene. 20 years ago, when I first got to know you, the phrase in the air was black swans. Calamities like oil spills or something come out of nowhere without warning. They do awful damage, sometimes permanently, but they're never explained, though they are given a sort of mythic meaning. Trump time comes to feel like an age of black swans, one unexplainable idea or event after another in a universe that has suddenly become chaotic, without a history, without a direction or a sense of what's next. Can you imagine this as an age of black swans, one after another?
I can, but I don't actually think that's quite right. Remember that Taleb's main thing with the Black Swan is it's the impact of the highly improbable. There's nothing in the past data series that tells you this is coming, so there's no way you can prepare yourself for it. That simply isn't the case with Trump. That simply isn't the case with populism globally, the AFD, Brexit, Farage, wherever you want to go. These problems have been perfectly obvious if people wanted to look at them for the past 30 years, if not at least 20 years. You'll remember I wrote a whole book about this called Angrynomics with Eric Lonergan back in 2020. So we were saying back then, look, this is what's happening and where this is going to go. So if anything, in the menagerie of Taleb, these things are called grey swans. These are things that you know are probably going to happen, but you just pretend they're not going to happen, and then you get surprised when they actually happen. So I think it's more like grey swans. In terms of the shocks that they produce, could they be long-lasting? Are they temporary? Well, there's one version of events whereby we get to the midterms, things are absolutely awful, everyone recovers some sense, and then we all vote against them, and the Democrats take control, and we revert back to happy times. I just don't see that as happening. One, because who knows if there'll be midterms. But assuming that there are, there's also the problem with the Democrats, which is, what's their alternative? It wasn't clear what it was during the campaign, and you seem to have this kind of intergenerational conflict going on, not just left and right, but between the old guard of the Clinton era, who still believe in procedure and trying to obstruct things and occasionally cooperate. And then you've got people like AOC on the other side, which is like, no, we just need to do full opposition and give people a credible alternative. And they're the ones that are going out and doing rallies, which don't get a lot of press coverage, interestingly, where you get 100,000 people showing up and people are energized. So the Democrats themselves have to work out who they want to be as an opposition party and what type of opposition they want to offer and what type of alternative they want to offer. Because what's been on offer with the sort of the mainstream for the longest time, a kind of technocratic wonkery of trust us, we're the top 10%, we know what we're doing, regardless of whether it's true or not, it's simply not believed by the majority of voters anymore. So, they've got to figure that out. In terms of the long-term policy impacts on this one, when tariffs go up, they tend not to come down. When you have new ways of generating money, you tend to keep them. You might not get rid of the old ones, you might keep these as well. The notion that we're going to fund huge tax cuts through tariff revenue is probably complete nonsense. But you'll definitely raise a couple of billion, and that'll be useful, and we'll see if that sticks around.
That's interesting. I'll settle for the gray swans, but the most interesting thing about the black swans or the gray swans is accounting for what happened. And it seems to be, Trump's account for pretty much everything is, that was the worst trade deal ever in history back whenever. And we're always getting screwed in the world. These other countries are taking terrible advantage of us. That's his childhood or his paranoia or his state of mind at work. But it doesn't tell us at all what trouble we're in, and it doesn't point us to any kind of remedy.
No, I think that's quite correct, Chris. I mean, Here's my favourite way of arguing against this one, right? So if everybody's out to screw us, and the EU is quote-unquote an organisation that was put together to screw the United States, somebody has to explain the following to me. In 2008, just before the financial crisis, the EU and the US were exactly the same size, more or less, as economies. And now, after another 15 years of the EU screwing us, the United States is 1/3 bigger and 1/3 richer than the EU. So who exactly is screwing who? So yeah, those arguments are complete bunkum, but it's never been the argument and the sort of the facticity of any claim that's driven Trump forward or driven his support. It's more a feeling. It's a feeling amongst his supporters that basically they're drowning in bullshit, they're drowning in wokeness, they're drowning in stuff that they barely understand in terms of the way the culture is rapidly changing. They're wondering why their wages never go up, but they look at the top 10% and see it's going up. And then they make alliances with billionaires to make that better, which strikes me as exactly the wrong thing to do. But again, it's not about sort of like, we've got this detailed plan and we're going to go through it. Some of it's chaos agency, some of it's basically deeply held beliefs, some of it's naked opportunism, and that's what makes it so hard to price what's coming next.
Yeah. No, that's closer to what I'm suggesting. But we end up living in a chaotic universe without a history or a direction, and God knows where it's heading. I mean, we don't give Donald Trump credit enough for winging it, for making up the story new every day, as you say. Every morning he's got a new headline, but it doesn't connect to yesterday, and it doesn't connect to reality. That's trouble.
Right, but remember, flood the zone, keep them guessing. I got to the point now where, I know that on Monday it's going to be some tweet or some executive order is going to come out and everyone's going to lose their mind for 48 hours over it. This week it was movies. We're going to tariff movies.
Yes.
Spoiler alert, you can't tariff movies. There's literally no way to do it as far as I can figure out. But that's not the point. The point is to keep us guessing, to keep us off guard. Because at the end of the day, I think these guys are going for what I call a Christmas tree payoff. So let me play this one out to you, Chris. At the top of the Christmas tree is the angel. And what's the angel? The angel is basically make America great again, global rebalancing. All the exporters consume more, all the consumption countries export more, we reskill the working class, we rebuild America. Really hard to do, particularly when you're kicking your universities in the nuts and destroying your state. But that's the top of the Christmas tree. Now, if you don't get the top of the Christmas tree, as you're falling down the Christmas tree, there's plenty of baubles and chocolates. And what are those things? Well, those things are like, sticking it to the scientific elite by shutting down the NIH, going after the universities because they're all woke and they're all liberal, and basically, going after the law firms and getting them to turn on people you don't like. It's all that level of stuff, and that seems to be quite sort of important and enjoyable for these guys. And then right at the bottom of the whole thing, secretly working its way through Congress in plain sight, is the largest tax cut in history. Now, let's remember that one of the reasons that we have all this debt is precisely because of the Trump tax cuts, and they're about to do it again. So even if they don't get global rebalancing in a new 19th century order, even if their universities manage to resist what they're doing and claw back funding, at the end of the day, they're going to walk out with about $1.5 trillion in tax cuts that are going to go straight to them and their mates. So let's not think this is any more sophisticated than a smash and grab on the state.
What can the Democrats do, if anything?
As I said, Chris, they've got to decide who they want to be when they grow up. The party is obviously demoralised because they lost, but it's not a surprise that they lost because they seem to have no policies other than everything's fine. And when vast majorities of people think it's not fine, that's not a winning strategy. And you've got two wings of the party now that want to go in very different directions. One is a much, much more aggressive alternative to basically woo the working class back to the Democratic Party that has elements of Trump in it to do with industrialization, etc., but a very different set of social policies to do with Medicare for all, etc., which is basically the Bernie AOC axis. And then you've got basically the incumbents in Congress who are all in their 70s who basically just want to do more of the same sausage making, even though the sausage factory seems to have dried up and died in a salmonella outbreak. So they have to figure out who they want to be and what they want to actually try and achieve. And they haven't been able to do that, I think, since quite some time, basically since the Obama administration.
Imagine this goes on for the rest of this term. Despite the fact that he is losing ground in his approval ratings, what's the permanent damage to the country, the culture, the republic that brought you here that I enjoyed growing up in?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Fully paid up member of the club. I think the potential for the erosion of rule of law, the epic amount of corruption that we're already seeing to do with like crypto scams in the family and all this sort of stuff. There's just a general sort of way in which even if the courts hold up and the Supreme Court acts as a bulwark, this is a type of aggressive, personalist, transactional presidency that basically tells the rest of the world, you can't trust America anymore, move on, it's not going to happen. Second thing is the Treasury market. I think that we've broken it. Even though the yields are down now, essentially what we did was to say that we are willing to take risks with the Treasury market, and given that that's the global savings asset, that's going to basically push people to try and find something else. It's very hard to find something else that could replace the dollar just because of the scale of what's done in dollars. I mean, most people don't know this, but more dollars are made outside the United States by non-US entities than made in the United States by the Fed and the Treasury.
That's amazing.
Right? So through euro-dollar loans and so on and so forth. So it's very hard to replace this, but ultimately you're giving everyone every incentive to do it. So, the damage is there, but it depends if you think it's damage, right? To go back to our earlier conversation, if you think the fundamental problem here is that we don't make anything and we pay for everything with credit notes called treasuries, and one day that bill's going to come true, then you want the dollar to be lower in value and you want people to buy less treasuries. So if you basically convince them that treasuries are not that great, then maybe that's part of your strategy. The thing is, though, there may be no strategy. I may be, as they put it, sane washing this entire thing and trying to find patterns where they don't exist. But I think there's a bit more joined up thinking than that out there. And I think that most of it, as you say, is going to cause some long-term damage. But for some people, one man's damage is another man's progress. What you look at as damage is what somebody else thinks is a result that they're going for.
Who is smiling in this, what we call chaotic scene?
Well, at this point, nobody's winning outright. I mean, ultimately, it seems to be the case that when Trump finds something that says no, he freaks out and then focuses on something else. So basically, Harvard, last week they were going to take away their tax-exempt status. Haven't heard much about this this week. China, basically, China's like, we don't have to do this and we don't care. The bond market, right? So I think that sort of there are constraints that are beginning to come up which are making these folks realize that they're not as omnipotent as they think. They've also got personnel problems, stuff in the different factions that are going on.
We won't even go into the future of Elon Musk.
Who knows how that one plays out? I mean, to me, Doge was essentially like a hacker team that went into the federal administration to get as much data as they can, and they fired people for cover. I think of it in a slightly different way. So maybe he's smiling. Maybe President Trump is still smiling. Maybe the guy who wrote 2025 is smiling. But there's a lot of people who've got a pretty nervous smile at this point because it's not quite going according to plan.
Mark Blyth, I cannot thank you enough. There's no voice out there that says the things that you say as clearly, and I don't know whether to say cheerfully or truly, but you're an incredibly valuable hybrid mind on this chaotic situation. I'm so glad you're here, and don't go away.
Chris, you're the one that helped me find my radio voice 20 years ago. I'll always be grateful to you for that. You can call me anytime.
Mark Blyth teaches political economics at Brown University. His new book with Niccolo Fraccaroli is titled Inflation, a guide for users and losers. Our conversation here at Open Source relies on listener support. If you haven't done your part yet, now's the time. Go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest running podcast going strong. Leave a comment while you're at it. We're proud to be a founding member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent, creator-owned podcasts. Our shows range from history to technology to politics to art. We come together around the principle that independent voices and independently funded media are more important than ever. You can learn more at hubspokeaudio.org. Thank you